Hello, my name is Kate Thomas, and I am a dual degree Master of Public Health and Doctor of Physical Therapy student at Arcadia University. Today, I will be presenting my capstone project for the public health portion of the program titled An Economic Policy Analysis on City Budgets and Rates of Community Violence. Here is my poster, and on the upcoming slides, I'll zoom in as I cover each section. Males in low-income urban neighborhoods have the highest risks for experiencing community violence, and this is due to public policies which create and enforce racially segregated neighborhoods with limited resources and concentrated poverty, as well as police implicit bias and disproportionate victimization and use of force against Black individuals. In addition, known protective factors such as adult supervision and having a positive relationship with an adult in the community are often rare in low socioeconomic neighborhoods. It can be hypothesized that with sufficient resources, community-based organizations will be able to adequately supervise youth and create environments where positive relationships between youth and adults can be fostered, which will result in a decrease in community violence. The purpose of my project was to see if there's a pattern between what kind of programs cities allocate money to in their budget and the rates of community violence in those cities. To do this, I conducted an economic policy analysis of Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, and Columbus in the years 2010, 2013, and 2016. These cities were chosen using purposive sampling for who is most at risk for experiencing community violence. When compared to the U.S. population, each of these cities have a lower than average socioeconomic status and a higher than average percentage of Black individuals. To determine if there appeared to be a pattern, I examined the expenditure of each city's budget and totaled the per capita spending on libraries, public welfare, health, housing and community development, and parks and recreation to create the composite variable community programming, and totaled the per capita spending on police protection and corrections to create the composite variable policing. Additionally, I examined the violent crime rates and incidents of officer-involved shootings in each city and totaled the incidents per 100,000 of murder and non-negligent manslaughter, robbery, aggravated assault, and officer-involved shootings to create the composite variable community violence. When examining the data, first I looked to see how the per capita spending to different programs changed each year, as well as how the different subvariables of community violence changed each year, and compared these values across the cities. I then ranked each individual city and year's rates of community violence from least to greatest, as well as the per capita spending on community programming and on policing least to greatest, to look for any potential patterns between per capita spending and rates of community violence. After that, I compared each spending gap to its corresponding community violence rank to look for any patterns between spending gap and rates of community violence. Finally, I graphed all three composite variables on one graph for each city, seen here. Each graph has the same scale and displays the rates of community violence per 100,000 and per capita spending on community programming and policing. The space between the community programming and policing lines represents the spending gap. As a result, I found that Philadelphia, while starting on the worst end, had improving rates of community violence each year. Additionally, Philadelphia spent the most out of all the cities on community programming and had the largest spending gap between per capita spending on community programming and policing. Columbus had the best rates of community violence, and they continued to improve each year. Similarly to Philadelphia, Columbus also spent a large amount on community programming and had a large spending gap between community programming and policing. Columbus also spent the least per capita on policing out of all the sample cities. Contrarily, Baltimore spent the most on policing, the least on community programming, and had the smallest spending gap. Baltimore also had the worst rates of community violence. Chicago spent a relatively constant amount per capita on both community programming and policing each year and had a relatively constant rate of community violence. In conclusion, there appears to be a slight pattern between higher spending on community programming and lower rates of community violence, and higher spending on policing and higher rates of community violence. There also appears to be a pattern between larger spending gaps between community programming and policing and lower rates of community violence. I recommend future studies to further investigate this pattern and statistically determine the relationship between the spending on community programming and policing and rates of community violence. Thank you for watching.